Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're in. And thank you for joining us today. We're going to give people a few minutes to finish joining us. In the meantime, while people are logging on, I'm going to go ahead and get some housekeeping out of the way. All the registrants are muted now except for the panelists. We're going to have a presentation that is probably about 20 or 30 minutes, and then we're going to have lots of time for questions at the end. So if you have a question during the presentation, you can type the question into the chat box, and then we'll be reading the questions off at the end. And if you don't see the chat box, you might need to click on the little orange arrow in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, and then the chat box should appear, and we'll be able to get to those questions at the end. We're also recording this webinar, so if anyone was not able to join us, or if you want to refer to any of the information later, we will have a recording up probably today, but at the latest on Monday. And everyone who was registered, whether they logged on or not, will get a follow-up email with a link to that recording. So if you have any colleagues or friends that wanted to join us but weren't able to get on, they will be able to view it later. So just a little bit about SSTI. We are a network of reform-minded state DOTs. We're founded in 2010, and we are a partnership of Smart Growth America and the University of Wisconsin. We operate at 3 levels: at an executive level community of practice, where participating agencies can learn and share experiences and implement smart transportation policies. We're also a source of direct technical assistance to agencies on transformative and replicable smart transportation reform efforts. And finally, we're a resource to the wider transportation community, including local, state, federal agencies, in their efforts to reform practice to changing social and financial demands. And you can see the states that we're working with. That map changes sometimes, depending on who's given us a call or attended some of our meetings. If you're interested in more information about SSTI, you can find it at our website, which is ssti.us. There's also a lot of resources, news articles, information, and things like that. You can also sign up for our newsletter there. Now, before I do introductions, once more, for anybody who's joined us, we will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, but you can type your questions in the chat box at any time, and then we'll go through those and do the questions at the end. And we're going to have lots of time for questions. So our speaker today is Beth Osborne, and she leads Smart Growth America's technical assistance for departments of transportation. She is also the senior policy advisor for SSTI, and she was previously at the U.S. Department of Transportation, where she served as acting assistant secretary for transportation policy and the deputy assistant secretary for transportation policy, beginning in 2009. More to the point, and relevant to today's talk, at USDOT, Beth managed the Tiger Discretionary Grant Program and the Secretary's Livability Initiative, the development of the administration's Surface Transportation Authorization Proposal, and the implementation of MAP 21. So she knows a lot about Tiger, which is now called BUILD, and we're going to hear more about that. So I'm going to give control of the keyboard and mouse over to Beth. And Beth, you can now go ahead and change the slides yourself.
Excellent. Thanks, Robbie. Good morning, afternoon to everybody. As Robbie said, we're going to be talking about the BUILD program. A lot of people have asked me what I think about the change in name. And it's an interesting little story. about where the tiger name came from. Originally, this program was developed as part of the Recovery Act. And so the initial name for the program was Transportation Investments Generating Economic Recovery, or TIGER. I'm an LSU grad, so I've always appreciated the name, but it's not, as some people think, that I imposed the name on it because of my LSU fandom. It was the Transportation Investment Generating Economic Recovery concept. For years, we've discussed the fact that we have moved out of the economic recovery phase, and therefore the name is out of date, and it was time to update it. Some people had suggested that we just needed to come up with a new R word. Instead of economic recovery, it would be economic something else that starts with an R. In the end, the last administration didn't change it just because everyone knew Tiger so well. We just felt that we should go with the branding. The new administration has changed it because A, they want to put their own brand on it, but B, like I said, the name economic recovery was out of date. And I think they came up with a very clever one. Build program, better utilizing investments to leverage development. So that's a new program, but when we look under the hood, not a lot has changed with it. So we're going to run through some of the basics of this round, and I'm going to spend most of my time focusing on what makes this round different from previous rounds. We will talk about some of the requirements that remain the same, but we just won't spend as much time on that. So some very basic concepts. Eligible applicants. If you are a public entity, you are an eligible applicant. If you are not a public entity, you can partner with a public entity. You just need a public entity as your lead. So you should think about the widest possible definition for a public entity. If you're a multi-state entity, if you are a transit agency or an independent agency or a health agency, if you got an eligible project and you are a public agency, you are eligible to apply. This is one of the reasons the program is as popular as it is. The majority of the program goes through state DOTs, with a small portion for transit agencies and a little bit for metropolitan planning organizations. With the BUILD program, any public agency can come in for funding. Eligible projects also have a very broad definition as well. It's really any surface transportation project. So that is highways, bridges, transit, bike ped, passenger rail, freight rail, ports. What it doesn't include is channel deepening in waterways, but all of the connected infrastructure at the ports is an eligible project. So, whatever it takes to get the freight off of the ships is probably an eligible project. In terms of how much money you need to bring to the program, there's what is eligible and there's what is competitive. But there's a wrinkle on that this year. So up to 80% of project costs in urban areas can get federal funds, and 100% of rural projects can get federal funds. Let's quickly review what is rural, because USDOT has a very broad definition of rural. Anything that is not in an urbanized area, according to the Census Bureau, is considered a rural area. So it's the absence of being in an urbanized area that makes your area rural. That's a very broad definition. And if you're in a rural area, you can get 100% of the project costs. In the past, while that does make you eligible, it did not necessarily make you competitive. And what DOT would do is consider, whether or not it demonstrated strong partnership to come to the federal government for 100% funds. Because it turns out when a locality really, really, really prioritizes a project, they generally have some skin in the game. Now, different areas put a different amount of skin in, and that might have to do with the economic circumstances of the community. It might have to do with the authority to raise money at that level. Some states do not let localities raise much money locally. And so they just don't have the authority to get independent funds. in many cases, USDOT found it impressive, even if the overall non-federal share was small, if it was made up of support from a whole lot of entities. So maybe a rural area came in with only a 20% match, but it came from 4 different partners. That could be more impressive than a 50% match from one partner. So really, it had always had kind of a proxy position for partnership and for commitment to the project. It also just happens to be that projects that have non-federal funding in them have a lot of flexibility in case they run into problems to keep the funding and the project moving forward. So all that was the case. But this time, Congress put language in the statute saying that non-federal match could not be a factor for awarding projects. I personally think that's a mistake, but a lot of this came from a fear from Congress that this administration was putting too much focus on localities' ability to raise money, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. There's also some interesting language on minimum and maximum awards this time. The minimums are the same as last round, where it's you have to ask for at least $5 million in federal funds for urban projects and $1 million in federal funds for rural projects. This round will also have planning grants. There's a small portion set aside for planning grants, and there's no minimum there. The maximum award is new. They've always had a maximum amount of funding that can go to each state, but this time they're saying no project can receive more than $25 million from this program. That had been a de facto maximum, but not a statutory maximum until this round. In the past, where the program only had $500 million per round, and they had to have geographic diversity in their awards, and they had to have modal equity, and they have to have an urban-rural split, that there's just a certain amount of spreading the peanut butter that had to be done to meet all of those requirements, and so nobody got more than $25 million. But in the first round of Tiger, when there was $1.5 billion, they were able to spread that peanut butter a little more thickly. And so there were a few projects that were up near $100 million when there was more funding overall. So there was a lot of hope on my part that with the increased funding this round, they're back up to $1.5 billion, that we could see some real projects of regional significance and some more significant federal funding. But Congress decided they wanted to see more projects, not a handful of big projects. So they put a maximum. I see that as a missed opportunity and rather disappointing. Reminder to folks that applications are to be submitted through grants.gov. They are due by 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 19th, 2018. This is not a movable deadline. And there is no excuse, including the system failing, that will be accepted by USDOT to get your grant in. I will tell you, grants.gov is not designed to handle programs with the popularity level of this program. This program gets more activity than any other program government-wide. And so if you wait till the last day to get your project submitted, you are running a very high risk that there will be a problem. And even if USDOT claims that they have accepted your application, they will not make an award to any project that has been received late. So my suggestion is start uploading your grant application several days before. Test your grants.gov password. Make sure you have all the information you need well before the due date. So a quick review. First 9 rounds, there were 7,500 applications received for $145 billion in requests. Only about 6% of those who came and asked for funding actually received any funding. They usually received partial funding. Sometimes it was a haircut where an applicant came in and asked for 30 million and they got 25 million, and DOT said we still expect to see the whole scope. Sometimes an applicant might come in for a $30 million project, but it had two segments, and USDOT came back and said, we will fund one aspect of your project for 10 million or something like that. But even winners are often disappointed to find out that they don't get their whole project. Doing well in this program means you have aligned well with the merit criteria. You've demonstrated strong collaboration and partnership with other jurisdictions, with stakeholders in the community, the business community, civic, neighborhood groups, those sorts of things, and your elected representatives, both at the local, state, and federal level. Competitive projects are innovative, and that can mean you're using an innovative project delivery mechanism, financing mechanism, the design itself, outreach in order to work with the community, really any innovation, something considered a best practice, you're going to try it out, we're going to learn something from it. That always does well here. But not a demonstration project. It has to be a permanent project and a capital project to be eligible here. And the big one is some evidence that this project will be able to obligate funds by September 30th, 2020. Now, most people know in the SSTI world what obligation is, but for those that have not dealt with USDOT funds, it's important to know that first off, federal funds do not come in a check. It is all reimbursable. So you have to have the cash flow to be able to fund the project and then seek reimbursement along the way. And that obligation is basically all of the engineering has been done, any permitting has been completed, and about the time you're ready to put your bid package on the street is when you can obligate those funds. So showing a schedule that gets you to obligation, frankly, DOT will want to see it by June 30th, 2020, wanting to have some wiggle room in case something goes wrong. And they will run your schedule past their regional and division staff through federal highways or federal transit or federal railroad to see if they think that your schedule looks realistic. So reviewing the merit criteria, this has not changed except for one thing. So safety, state of repair, economic competitiveness, quality of life, environmental protection, all of those have been criteria since the first round of Tiger, with secondary criteria of innovation and partnership. And actually Congress is so supportive of this program, they put into law that this administration has to maintain the same merit criteria that's been in the program since the beginning. What the administration has done is added one additional measure, and that's the non-federal revenue for transportation infrastructure, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail in a minute. So let's talk about each of these criterion one by one. What does it mean to score well on safety? It means that you're fostering a safe system for the movements of goods and people, of all movers. So if it looks like you're sacrificing one group for another, that's unlikely to score well on safety. You could be impacting the number of crashes, the rate of crashes. You could be looking to reduce the damage of the crashes. Maybe we won't decrease the number of crashes, but you'll reduce the number of fatalities in those crashes. All of that could show a safety improvement. Specifically, they're always looking for elimination of conflicts, particularly highway rail grade crossings, and anything that could prevent an unintended release of hazardous materials. In terms of state of repair, you're going to see, if you read the NOFO, there's a big focus on consistency with asset management plans. So we're supposed to be doing broad-based asset management now. And so the extent to which you can show that this project fits in with your overall asset management plan, you're really going to do much better. Even if it's a bridge that needs to be replaced, if it scores poorly in your asset management plan and is not considered a big priority for the region, that's going to be a problem. So really referring back to what you're doing in your asset management plans is quite helpful. And anything that you can do that shows that this investment is going to reduce the life cycle cost for the project and its maintenance would help. And showing that having a failure in this area of the infrastructure will cause systematic problems is another way to show how important it is to be repaired within a broader asset management structure. In terms of scoring well on economic competitiveness, one of the things people think about is improving congestion, reducing congestion. And you'll see that decreasing transportation costs is something they specifically mention, and improving access to employment centers. But you're going to notice in the NOFO a particular focus on access to employment center for people in rural areas. And while this administration has been pretty hostile to transit, and they only funded 2 transit projects in the last round, which was about 4% of grants. After the last 8 rounds, transit received generally someplace between 25 and 30% of grants. We are expecting them to be a little more open to transit this time, particularly transit that connects people to employment centers, and particularly transit that connects rural areas to job opportunities, medical facilities, things like that. Other things in economic competitiveness is something that could increase the economic productivity of land, result in long-term job creation. Keep in mind, they're not super excited about construction job creation. 2 things to keep in mind there. One is that there's a little bit of we could pay people to dig ditches and call it an employment program. That's not what they're looking for. But it's also that in a benefit cost analysis, labor is a cost, not a benefit. It's we have to pay for that labor. So they're looking for long-term job creation. Like, this will open up this area for development, maybe for a manufacturing facility or something that's going to create long-term jobs. In terms of projects that score well on environmental protection, this is broad. A lot of folks think it has to do with air quality. It does, but it has to do with more than that. It has to do with protection of wetlands, sensitive lands, parklands, endangered species, water quality. Some projects that often really stand out in this section are ones that are using green infrastructure for stormwater management. Green infrastructure has some safety benefits. It has great environmental benefits. It's a low cost benefit, and it also has lower life cycle costs than piping. So that's something that often stands out. Anything that could result in brownfield redevelopment is another really good one here. This administration is also putting in this criterion a focus on ways to improve or streamline environmental reviews. So if you are coordinating with your state historic preservation officer, or you've done some sort of programmatic agreement to deal with endangered species in your region, that might be something to profile here if it's going to help this project. In terms of scoring well in quality of life, this is about increasing transportation choices for travelers. And increasing access to essential services, maybe groceries, schools, medical care, those sorts of things, improving connectivity. And this administration is also including access to broadband. So if in your project there's going to be broadband deployment, definitely highlight that as well. And then there's the new criterion that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about, and that is non-federal revenue. So basically they're saying those that have found a way to raise money locally to support transportation investment will get an increased advantage in this program. Now, this is a good time to mention these are the 6 criteria, but it does not mean that there's any expectation that to win funding, you have to hit it out of the park on all 6. Generally, projects that are funded do well in 2 to 3 criteria. So you might have a project that is a great quality of life, safety, and economic competitiveness project, and that's what it is. Or you have a great state of repair project that also has some safety benefits, and it's just beautiful in those 2 areas. That can score very well and win funding. But these are these 6 areas overall that by the end, they hope their portfolio, when you put it together, advances the needle on all of them. There's no notion that every single project has to advance the system on every single criteria. So those of you that have raised non-federal revenue since 2015 should highlight that. And a lot of people want to know what that means, like what revenue counts. what I'm hearing from USDOT is they want you to tell them what should count. And if you can show them that you have done something to raise revenue and it's going to go to transportation, they're all ears for what that could be. They're going to take the broadest possible view of this. So maybe you engage in asset recycling where you sell, in the region, an airport has been privatized and the money purchased, or money generated from the purchase is being utilized to rebuild a bunch of roads in the area. That counts. Does it have to be associated with this specific project? No, it does not. In fact, because Congress said that match cannot be something that they consider, they are trying to draw a line between coming up with a new non-federal revenue and any sort of match requirement. I will tell you that I think that that is a very difficult case to make, and word is from Capitol Hill that they're not too pleased about this. Nonetheless, USDOT is claiming that it is they mean for it to be different than just match to a particular project. So for example, you could have a rural area that's asking for 100% federal funds on this project in build, but they've recently come up with money for transportation by a local sales tax initiative. They're just not putting it towards this project. It could include tax increment financing, a property tax through the region. Maybe you're building a transit station that's going to include some retail, and you're going to get funding from the leases that is going to support transportation. So long as that funding is going into transportation, you can tell USDOT that it's to meet this criterion. So I think to some extent, they're going to have to see what they get, and then they'll probably come back next year with a much better idea of what it turns out they meant by this. And so my advice to you is make your best case and tell them why they should see what you've done locally as meeting this criterion. Okay, they also are asking applicants, saying that you can apply for a program of projects. You could come in and say, for example, I just raised money with a local sales tax, and there are 10 projects that we want to fund, and we want to seek funding through build for a bunch of them. You have to submit a separate application for each of them, but I think especially if you're coming in with non-federal revenue, you have to come in with non-federal revenue to apply for a program of projects. And as long as each one of those projects meets the eligibility requirements, for example, an urban project has to be a request for between $5 and $25 million, then you can apply for a whole bunch of them, and it can exceed the 3 application limit. But it's going to only be open to those that are coming in with some local revenue that has recently been raised. One other thing I want to mention is some people are asking, what if I created, for example, a TIF district that was created in 2014, but the money doesn't start flowing until 2016? Does that meet this 2015 limit on when the new funding could have been raised? And I think you can make a very good case that is appropriate. And my early indications from USDOT is they will accept that. So again, I would approach this as telling them what they meant. Innovation and partnership, we talked a little bit about this. It's very broad. If you're trying something that you don't try, it doesn't even have to be innovative nationally. It may be a best practice that other states have gotten familiar with and yours hasn't yet, and you want to try it out. It's something new for your area, and you're going to try it in build. And if it works out, maybe you take it back in your overall program. That's innovation. That can get their attention. And it can be innovation in contracting or safety or funding. It doesn't really matter, just anything that's new to the program. And partnership means partnership between jurisdictions, regional partnership, partnership between local and state, and it also means partnership with local stakeholders on the private side. Project readiness and BCA. Project readiness, like I said, they are really looking for whether or not you have a schedule for your project that will get them to obligation by September 30th, 2020. And there are certain things that raise the risk of that. If you have a lot of right-of-way acquisition to do, that's going to make them nervous. It's going to make that a riskier project because there could be a property owner along the line that is going to be very difficult to work with. So the more you have that wrapped up, the more competitive your project will be. Now, it's important to recognize that they don't even get to the project readiness review until they have determined that they rate your project highly on the primary criteria. So you're going to have to prove that you're a great economic competitiveness and safety project first. And then once they pick their top tier projects in those areas, in the primary criteria, then they will evaluate the project readiness in BCA. But they won't even get to those questions if you didn't rate highly on the initial 6 criteria. And then what they do is they take those finalists and they send them out to their regional staff and their district staff. And they say, look at the schedule and tell me if this makes sense. And you generally get one of 3 answers. One is, yep, this looks good. I'm familiar with this project and I think they're absolutely right on the schedule. We consider this to be low risk. Another response is, I have never heard of this project. I have no idea. That's not the end for you, but that's not good. Generally, projects that are well developed and likely to obligate on time, somebody in the district office has heard of it. And so that can raise some red flags. And the third answer is, oh yeah, I know this project and they are crazy. There's no way they'll meet this deadline. We know that this is going to be a full EIS because there's a wetland it's going through. It's going to be a huge issue and very difficult, or it's going to have massive community opposition or something like that. When you find those, some projects are higher risk. Generally, what USDOT wants to do is make sure they don't have too many high-risk projects that they are taking on. So they'll have 2 or 3 of the 50 that they fund. This time I think they'll be closer to 150 projects. So they might go higher, maybe the proportion gets up to 9 or 10 higher risk projects. But there's a lot of staffing that goes into higher risk projects, and they're going to pick projects that they are confident that with the proper staff resources, they can get it to obligation on time. They do not like losing funding due to missing that obligation deadline. The BCA, interestingly, they have changed some of the language in the NOFO about whether or not saying that the benefits must exceed the costs. I still think it's going to be very hard to justify a project where the costs clearly exceed the benefits, even though they didn't state that outright. The benefit cost analysis, there's a lot of guidance on how to do that online, and webinars available. I highly encourage you to look at them. But the trick here is to think about who are the beneficiaries of the project and find the ways to quantify those benefits as best you can. And keep in mind that sometimes things that we consider a general political benefit, like we're creating construction jobs in a BCA, they're not a benefit, they're a cost. Those are people we have to hire and pay for. All right, so some of the traps that people run into in a project is they submit something that's ineligible, and it can be so disappointing. I remember a project that applied in a round that required a $10 million minimum request for urban grants, and they were applied for $9,900,000. $9,900,000. So almost 10 million, but we had to reject it outright because it was below the minimum, and there's no way to rectify it, and there's no way to fix it. It's not like DOT will come back and ask you to make a revision. It has to be in and fully eligible on the first day. Another thing is, instead of asking for funding for a capital project, people ask for operating funds. The build funds cannot be used for operations. So if you have any questions about your project, this is a great time to reach out to your local FTA offices or FHWA offices, familiarize them with the project, let them know what you're trying to do, because if they catch you going in a direction that could get you in trouble in eligibility, they can steer you right now. Another thing is a lot of times, and this was particularly true early in the program, where people would come in and say, this is a super important project because it's a high priority for us. That's not what the build program is about. The question is, do you have a project that addresses one of our priority criteria areas? If you do, we would love to invest in it. If you don't, you need to find another program. So alignment with the merit criteria is essential. Claims of project benefits that have no evidence to support them tend to do very poorly. You'll hear a lot of times when DOT meets with folks to debrief them on a review that they'll say, we just didn't see how this benefit actually came from the project. There was nothing supporting it. We've talked about project readiness. That's another one. Insufficient matching funds, especially when it's an urban grant, you haven't come up with your statutory minimum of 20%. And this last one, I can't tell you how many calls we got at USDOT in the last week or the last day saying we went online and realized that our DUNS number was no good or had expired. Well, it's too late to fix it now. There's nothing that can be done. I could not more strongly encourage everybody today that is considering to apply for build to log on to grants.gov today and make sure everything is working, to go check your SAM number, to confirm your DUNS number, and make sure it's all in working order this week, because you have time to fix it if it's not. But if you wait until June, you won't. Updating an address in SAM, for example, can take 2 to 4 weeks. So please do not push that off. All right, so what's going to happen after you submit in July? There's a statutory requirement that announcements are made by December 18th, 2018. Congress has never required that before, but the administration took so long to get the last round out, Congress isn't going to let them wait that long again. I've heard that there's some interest at USDOT to beat this December deadline. I don't know if they'll be able to do it because they have a whole lot of programs on the street at the same time, but they're going to try. If you get a grant from the build program, there's then a process where you sign and execute a grant agreement. That's when you have to bring your match and demonstrate it and set the scope, schedule, and budget for the project and commit to everything in a signed agreement. There's a bunch of reporting requirements, and along the way, sometimes project modifications might need to happen, but they have to include changes to your grant agreement if there's any change to scope, schedule, or budget. And then there's a project completion and closeout process and a performance management process whereby USDOT will work with the grantee to determine what we expect in benefits and then measure whether or not we got what we set out to get. I really want to encourage people, if you have put in an application before, to go to USDOT and ask for a debrief. I personally did hundreds of these in the first 5 rounds that I worked on. Every single person that ever came in, either in person or did this over the phone, went on and on about how incredibly helpful it is to have a sense of what resonated with USDOT. I think one of the things that's really important for you to consider is staff is going to be reading, every single reviewer is going to have to read someplace between 30 and 60 25-page applications in a very short period of time. It is a swirl of information about places you have never been to. So you really should think about how to spoon feed information about your town to someone as if they have never heard of it and they are completely unfamiliar with your area, and recognize that they're reading just dozens and dozens of applications. So the clearer you can make your application, the easier to remember and the easier to dig through and grab the basic information they need, the more they're going to like your application. Utilize the webinars that USDOT does. Call them, ask them questions. They have resource guides. Any question that pops up, they're there to bother. Call them. And I think that brings me to the end, and I can take questions at this point.
Unmuted.
Thank you. We were just getting ourselves organized on this end as well. We do have some questions that have come in, but if you have not yet submitted your question, I just wanted to remind you that you can type it into the chat box, and you may need to click on the little orange arrow in the upper right of your screen to do that. And we'll go ahead and take questions. We have lots of time to do that. So the first question is, word is that local municipal bonds will not be allowed as a match for these projects. Is this true? And if so, why not? I guess why or why not?
Yeah, I have heard the same thing, and I don't understand that, and I don't think you should accept that. Look, this is an idea that USDOT has had, and let's just talk about where it comes from. There is an acknowledgement at the federal level that no one there is ever going to be comfortable, or not in the near future, in raising revenues. And so this is a clever way to say, I don't want to do it. Y'all got to do it. And if they can find some success in this, it is going to be useful to prove that they're using federal dollars to leverage other people to do the hard work. I don't think that USDOT staff are fully aware of how limited some localities' authorities are for raising money. That in many places, you have to go to your state legislature and get authority to go to your own taxpayer. And bonding is really your only way for raising money. And I think you all need to push that and not accept. This is something that we need to spend the next few weeks pushing. And I will just say this. They can say what they expect to get all they want. We did it too when it was the Obama administration and I was working there. And you don't get what you're looking for a lot, and you have to reassess based on what comes in. And so I think that they're going to have to reassess. I think they're going to have no choice. And especially where this is your one authority for raising funding, you should push hard on it. And I will say, I did talk to staff and point out that in some states, like I said, you have to go to your state legislature for approval to go to your own voters, and it's being denied. I would push that really hard. In fact, I have suggested to USDOT that should be held against the state if they're not permitting their locals to raise money. So yes, this is a stumbling block, but like I said, this is a totally new area. I think you should push back on that with all of your might and put it in your application and make the case that this is your means for raising money and it should count.
Okay. The next question we have is, do these funds only apply to construction and not design permitting?
Yeah, so there are some planning grants. So you can apply specifically to do planning in this round, and that has not happened in every round of Tiger or, well, now Build. There's only been 2 other rounds before where you could apply specifically for planning funds. You can apply to, so if you apply for $10 million and you want to use some small portion of that towards like final design or something like that, there is some authority to allow for that. But generally, if you have to use too much funding in that area, that's going to weigh against you in project readiness.
Okay. So we've got a couple questions regarding eligible applicants, and one is regarding public entity eligibility. Are transit authorities that are structured as corporations still eligible if they provide transit service to the general public? And then I'm just going to sort of throw this in as well. If equity partners with a local government for a P3 where both take demand risk, is this project eligible?
Okay, those are great questions. If you are listed as a transit agency, so if you're receiving FTA funding as a transit agency, you're going to be eligible. That's probably the best way to judge whether or not you reach that cutoff. And as for whether or not you have an equity stake, it doesn't really have a lot to do with that. It has to do with who the chief applicant is and who is going to receive the funding and who is going to manage the funding and who is going to be responsible for the funding. So you could have a city that plans to work with they plan to have some private provider actually build the project. It's still going to be the city that signs the agreement with the FHWA or FTA or whoever it's going to be, and it's going to be ultimately responsible. And they might go hire someone to then do the work, but the agreement's going to be between the feds and the public entity. And so having them there in that position is what's going to be important.
Okay. So then we have a question about the weighting of the different factors. Has a final determination yet been made by USDOT as to the defined selection criteria, rating factor points, 5 points, 10 points, etc.?
There are no points. I can make this very simple. There are no points. They don't assign points. They rate things under every criterion is even.
Okay.
They're all of equal value, and you will be rated according to this point scale: highly recommended, recommended, acceptable, not recommended.
Okay.
And they're going to look across the projects that get a highly recommended in 2 or more areas are the ones that are going to be forwarded into a finalist group.
Okay. Let's see. So I was reading the question, so if you answered this, I apologize, but we had several questions about planning. I'm just going to scroll back up here. If applying for a planning grant, do we focus the application on planning activities or the project itself?
Great question. Yeah, great question. I would focus on the project itself. What you're trying to achieve, because the trick with planning, of course, is that you're not going to have a project of independent utility completed when you complete the planning. But the whole question is whether or not the project that you're asking to plan is worthwhile. So the project itself that you're planning has to have some promise of meeting 2 or more of the merit criteria to be worth funding to plan. So focus on the project you hope to build.
Okay, so that probably might answer this as well. That you mentioned there's no minimum amount for planning projects, but then you said that projects need to be for capital projects. Does this mean that planning projects need to be planning for capital projects? Can you elaborate? Yes, on planning.
Yes, good question.
Okay.
Very good question. Yes, you can't be planning a demonstration project or a pilot. You've got to plan something that is going to be at the end a capital project and of independent utility. So one of the questions we get a lot are, I have a big project that doesn't fit in this eligibility criteria. Can I build a phase of the project? And the answer is yes, you can, if at the end that there's going to be a project of independent utility. So for example, I have 3 miles of roadway I wanted to build, but I can build 1.5 miles of it and connect 2 other roads. That's good. But if you wanted to only build, if you wanted to grade a road and then you would need a further grant to come down and surface the road, nope, there won't be any user of it after it's graded. So it needs to be a project of independent utility. After built, it's going to be usable. In the planning grant, you have to be seeking to plan a project. Maybe you're going to do the NEPA or a big public engagement process around a complicated project, but in the end, that needs to be a capital project.
And then someone had a question about the definition of urban. Is it the same as used to define MPO, urban areas, 50,000 population or greater, or is it more the census definition of urban?
Good question. The census definition of urbanized area is used to determine whether or not an area should get an MPO. So when you're designated as an urbanized area, that's an area of 50,000 or more, that's when you can qualify to get your own MPO. So it's kind of the same thing.
Okay. Let's see. For the planning grant aside within the build program, set aside within the build program. Would long-range transportation plans for a council of governments be eligible? Would that be an eligible project?
I don't think so. No, I think it really needs to be around a capital project. If there is, yeah, I think it'd be really hard to make that justification. There was HUD funding that would fit something like this very well in their Sustainable Communities program, but Tiger is very project focused.
Okay. Is there a template that we can use to structure applications?
There is not a template. I wish there were. This is a little bit of a dream of mine, is to create an online portal where instead of doing your own application and attaching it, you would actually enter information in a standardized form. I think it'd be easier to review, and it would help smaller communities that don't have budgets for fancy grant applications to be more on par. But no, they don't have that right now. If you're looking for an example of some good applications, you can Google Tiger applications, and a lot of folks who have won grants in the past have posted their application, and that's not a bad place to start. I know, for example, the Atlanta streetcar, you can Google their application and see it. I'm not sure others. I want to say maybe the Rochester Interloop project application was online. So I might just look at some of the folks that have won in the past and get a sense of what looks good. I will say some of the elements that really, really help are, having pictures and really good maps so that I can contextualize where your project is, what the community is like, and what it's going to look like in the end is super helpful. And again, just assume the person reading the application has never been to your community and has no familiarity with the project or the community at all. So the more you can give them some maps and some pictures of the area, the more helpful it's going to be. And I also think there's some very, very little things that make a big difference when reviewers are trying to discuss your project. There are certain facts that they need to be able to rattle off and share with their superiors, and the more you lay that out for them, the more they like you. So the basic thing they need to be able to talk about in your project is applicant X. So who clearly is the applicant, starting up front, very helpful, is seeking Y amount of funding and matching it with Z amount of funding to build this right up front. I can't tell you how often I have to dig. I used to have to dig through 2 or 3 pages to even figure out what the project was. People talk about how great it's going to be, how many jobs it's going to create, how safe it's going to make the community, how important it's going to be, and you keep saying, "What is it? What is the project? It sounds great. What is it?" Put it up front as soon as possible. We are connecting road A and B with a new road. We are addressing this congested intersection by redesigning the intersection. We are addressing this conflict point by adding a turn lane. Like, just put it in plain, one sentence, black and white, right up front.
Okay. And I think you did answer this, but maybe not. Let me just ask, can a city apply for multiple projects?
Yes, a city can apply for multiple projects. You can submit up to 3 projects, but if you are coming in with non-federal funds, you can apply for what they call a program of projects, which allows you to go beyond the 3, and it helps to show how they are somehow connected, like we're replacing all the deficient bridges in town or something like that. I will say, however, it is hard. These are not easy applications to do. And one of the problems that we saw in the first couple rounds of Tiger is people spread themselves thin by submitting lots of applications, and none of them were given the time and attention they truly deserved. So I would focus on doing 1 or 2 really good applications rather than doing lots of not so great applications. If you have a lot of capacity, maybe you can go beyond that. But generally, I find when folks come in around 1 or 2, that's better. I also find that it's easier to gather strong partnership and funding around just 1 or 2 projects than spreading yourself too thin. And in the end, because you can only put $150 million to any one state, there's only so far you can really go in putting lots of funding in one place. So usually what ends up happening is USDOT wants a clear understanding of which one was your favorite. And if, for example, you have members of Congress call in and say, there are 10 projects in my district that I love, the first thing that's going to be asked is, yeah, you got 10 projects. Which is your favorite? Name it. Name names. I won't tell anybody out in the public, but I'm going to make you tell me. Otherwise, I'm going to disregard what you just said. Okay. So, I mean, that's always the case. There needs to be some sense of where your real favorite is. Now, if your project doesn't do well, and this happened with members of Congress all the time, they would call in and say, I've got this great BRT project and it's super important, you have to fund it. And we would say to the secretary, bad news, that project did really poorly in our ratings. And so the secretary would say, good to know that you love the BRT project. What's your second favorite project? And right. And if we could find the project that was in the members' priority and scored well, that overlap in the Venn diagram, then we might have a deal.
Okay. Little political trading there.
Yeah, politics plays a role. Politics, if I've got 3 projects in the state of Oregon that we love, and one of them has a ton of support from your congressional delegation, that's the tiebreaker, end of story. But if your delegation loves a project that USDOT hates, not getting funded. So that's the role of politics.
Mm-hmm. So we had a question about the benefit cost analysis, a couple of them actually. One of them is, does it include LCCA maintenance, operation costs, etc.?
Yes, you should include life cycle costs in your benefit cost analysis, and especially if there are ways to reduce that. If the way you're doing the project is going to reduce it, that's great. I would say if there's some chance you either have an economist on staff or maybe in a university locally, I'd go work with someone like that to do this. Sometimes I will say this about USDOT. They're very traditional in their benefit cost analysis view and what should count. And by traditional, I mean old-fashioned and not very innovative. But a good economist can push the envelope with them. I would not go out and spend a ton of money on a BCA. I think it's better to go work with maybe your academic institution and have the support from a professor or a grad student that maybe you could get some credit from working on it than spend a whole lot of money on it.
Okay, we're going to make this the last question, but before we do, I just want to remind everybody that we will have a recording up on the website, and if you want to find out more about SSTI, subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on Twitter, go to our website, ssti.us, and I do want to thank Beth for her time and a fantastic amount of information. I know that she just is a wealth of information, and this is great. This is just great. This is going to be our last question. Somebody wanted to know, how will a Greenway project rate?
It kind of depends. I have to say, one of the things I was struck by in the last round of Tiger, and this isn't a better round for everybody because this is the second Trump administration round. So we have some insight into what they've funded in the past and what they're likely to fund again. But I will say Main Street's projects in general did shockingly well. Now, a Greenway might be a bigger stretch for them, but they are not hostile towards complete streets. In fact, they were pretty generous to complete streets in the past. So I will say, even for the Obama administration, and we funded a handful of Greenways, what we did not like was Greenways that really focus on recreation. This is a transportation program, and it should be connecting people in a serious transportation way to their needs and services. And so you should be seeking to show that this is going to get people to work. and people are going to use it to get them to work. Not that it's going to be a beautiful recreational opportunity. That's not going to score well with anybody. So if you can show that this Greenway is going to be a real transportation corridor for commuters or for something like that, then I think you might have a case. I will also say, remember last round, there was a huge focus on rural projects. Over 60% of projects funded were rural. And they're going to push in that direction again this time to go very heavy in favor of rural communities. So a Greenway is going to do a lot better if it's a rural community Greenway than an urban one.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Beth. Thanks again, and thank you everybody else for joining us today. If you have further follow-up questions, you can send them to us at ssti.us. You'll be getting an email. It'll have my email, and I can pass them on if people have further questions. But it sounds like people might want to talk to their FTA or FHWA local offices as well, and make sure that they're looped in to have a strong application. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.